And good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Hopefully we will be able to avoid the sound of my nose coming through the microphone as we had last time. But thank you for tuning in to part 2 of church history. As a quick overview, I think we'll use a map later, but we had discussed how Christianity, of course, had begun around Jerusalem, which became the Holy See. I think I forgot to mention that the Council of Jerusalem was the first council in church history. So that was also documented in the book of Acts. I think that's where they decided not to follow Jewish law. Then we had the city of Alexandria, which was the ancient city of learning in the ancient world. Then the other Holy See was Antioch. And these were enumerated and counted in the councils. And then finally we have Constantinople, which today is still technically the most important Orthodox Holy See. And finally, we have Rome, where, of course, the Catholic Church is based. And of course, all the bishops claim apostolic succession in the Catholic and Orthodox and Anglican and probably Lutheran churches. But we know that around the year, beginning of the 8th century or the 10th century, most of North Africa and the Middle East fell under the influence of Islam. And quite likely, there were Christian communities that actually thrived, and also Jewish communities that thrived in the Muslim world. But pretty much the torch of Christendom had gone to the West. And then, like I said, there was a Crusader counterattack, which was pretty important, but nonetheless failed. I don't think I have that pen. I told myself to bring a red pencil. But to give a crash course to anyone who may just quickly need it, this would be France. And eventually, out of Latin, you have all these countries. So let's just call it España, which is Spain. We have Portugal, Germany. This is Denmark. This would be the Netherlands, but also I think I realized I forgot to draw Belgium. Now, somebody asked me about England before. It's important to understand that the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, is actually 4 countries. It's England, Wales, and the Queen of England is actually queen of all of these. And then you have Scotland, which is up in the north. You have Ireland, but then you also have Northern Ireland over here, which is under the jurisdiction of the British. So it's a hot button topic. But all of these form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And we will go into some of this. So this is, I believe, Sweden. My knowledge of Scandinavia is not so great. Poland. You have the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia, which comes later. One of these is Austria and Hungary. Actually, so Austria neighbors Germany. So this is Austria. And I think this is Hungary, and that's Ukraine. Yes. So, Ukraine is kind of, all this is like hinterland. This is Lithuania, Estonia. I believe this is modern day Hungary or Romania. So, anyway, again, a lot of these countries may not exist, or they exist in a very different form today. But and obviously this is Greece. This is the Balkans, which I'm not going to label. But, this forms modern day Turkey. And obviously this would be Russia. So, Russia, we discussed Orthodoxy and other things. So right now, we went up to how the church was split between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. But what happened was the Crusades were a counterattack. Especially, it was called by the Pope in Rome, but the manpower was France and England, which sent troops, but they couldn't sustain it for long. So it was mostly considered, it was an attempt, but obviously since they didn't get Jerusalem, it was not a very successful attempt at retaking the Holy Land. But France was always trying to argue for legitimacy of the Catholic as a true Catholic monarchy. And I'm very sorry. 1 second, please. My cat is at the... Okay, thank you very much for waiting. So this will discuss... So around the year, I believe... So now 1100, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem. They set up some mini-kingdoms. 90 years later, Saladin repels them back. So by 1190, it's over. They never retake Jerusalem again. But what it does is, Islam receives a lot of the inheritance of the Greek learning from the ancient world. Even though it collapses the Byzantine Empire, it keeps some of the knowledge and the Jewish knowledge and such alive. And therefore, it reintroduces that into the Latin West, which had been lost at that time. And therefore, the people's horizons kind of widen, and also their palates widen. They have a penchant in Europe for spices from the East and stories from the East. So there's a lot of romanticization. Now, I actually never liked European history much, and that's why it's funny. This book was the first book that I ever found that actually got me liking it. And so... the funny thing is, the full title of the book is probably why I like it so much. A Modern History from the Time of Luther to the Fall of Napoleon, published in 1877, but for the use of schools and colleges. So, in the sense that it's meant to be kind of like a textbook, and it's also meant to be kind of also a fun read. So, I don't know how much coloring I'll do also. But I prefer to be teaching out of this textbook. And that way, because it's not particularly my reign of expertise, I just feel like it's the best way to put light onto this situation. And we'll just go over it, and hopefully I'll have time. The period at which this history commences. Well, Chapter 1. The state of European society in the 15th and 16th centuries. So, we're going from the time of Luther to the fall of Napoleon. Even though, 1877 is a long way from us, I feel like somebody who's looking at the events, they're kind of, they're just looking at history from their point of view, which shouldn't be too outdated because they're still ahead of those two times. The period at which this history commences, the beginning of the 16th century, when compared with the ages which had preceded it, since the fall of the Roman Empire, was one of unprecedented brilliancy and activity. So I think he's talking about the Enlightenment. It was a period very fruitful in great men and great events, and though stormy and turbulent, was favorable to experiments and reforms. The nations of Europe seem to have been suddenly aroused from a state of torpor and rest, and to have put forth new energies in every department of life. So Europe was undergoing a reinvigorization around the 15th century in knowledge and scientific knowledge and understanding. Torpor means a state of physical or mental inactivity, lethargy. So they were aroused from a state of torpor, from let me increase the font a bit just to make it easier for camera purposes. Though it was not used on the field of battle until 1346, it had great discoveries and inventions had been made. The use of movable type, first ascribed to a German of Mentz by the name of Gutenberg in 1441, and to Peter Schoeffer in 1444, changed vastly the whole system of bookmaking. So, the first date we are being given is movable type in 1441 AD, or Common Era CE. We have the first incident of movable type. And so, speaking of Gutenberg, though, you have this book available freely on Project Gutenberg. And it's something that I forgot to mention a little bit earlier, but the name Gutenberg kind of brings it up. changed the whole system of bookmaking and vastly increased the circulation of the scriptures, the Greek and Latin classics, and all other valuable works, which by the industry of the monkish copyist had been preserved from the ravages of time and barbarism. And so when you look at that sentence, it kind of just speaks kindly of the monks. What it says is that the monks were the ones who preserved the learning of the scriptures, preserved the learning of the ancients, and preserved the manuscripts that we had. So we should really be thankful for them. And obviously these are Catholic monks. So we should be thankful for them, because until we invented movable type, we really needed them to keep all this alive, all this tradition and learning. But the funny thing is, though, now the implication of that is also that we don't need it anymore. Gunpowder, whose explosive power had been perceived by Roger Bacon as early as 1280, though it was not used on the field of battle until 1346. So another invention that was really important is gunpowder. And we see the first use in 1346 AD. So that's the 14th century. And that's the battlefield use of gunpowder. So like he's saying, there's other people who saw the potential. Roger Bacon, who was a British guy. But we have the increased technology of the ability to blow holes in walls. And Constantinople was taken in 1453, something I got the date wrong in the last video. But so gunpowder was important to blasting those walls. The other thing I kind of wanted to point out, because we're now in the 1400s and 1500s and 1600s, so we've skipped a couple of hundred years, we've kind of consolidated the Crusades. But one of the reasons that English considers French culture and manners and style and word to be so upper class, and cuisine, like it's Indian cuisine is better than an Indian restaurant, right? Or Chinese cuisine, or so cuisine is a French word. But there was a French king named William the Conqueror, and in 1066 he was from Normandy, which is around here. He led a conquest of England, and because he was the ruler of England afterwards, English always kind of perceived the cultural importance of French. So we have words like denouement and rendezvous and hors d'oeuvres and pièce de résistance and repertoire. That all, like, probably half our words come from French, and therefore through the Latin at some point. Gunpowder completely changed the art of war and greatly contributed to undermine the feudal system. The polarity of the magnet, also discovered in the Middle Ages, but not practically applied to the mariner's compass until 1403, had led to the greatest event of the 15th century, the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus in 1492. So we have the magnetic compass finally perfected. If you imagine having a needle balanced in the water on a compass, perfecting that in principle is a much harder thing, so therefore that was done in 1403. I don't know why I did a dollar sign, but ignore that. So 1403 AD. And obviously in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. So you clearly see, what I love about this history book is that you have an understanding of history, which is contextual in the series of inventions. If we didn't discover the compass in 1403, then we would not have discovered America in 1492 or perfect the compass. This impulse given to commerce by this and other discoveries of unknown continents by the Portuguese, Spaniards, Dutch, English, and French cannot be enlarged on here. So what he's saying is that the Dutch here, the Portuguese, and the English and the French, these four nations were the ones who sailed ships that went all over the world. And you can see why, because they were maritime nations and they were very reliant upon their navies. America revealed to the astonished Europeans her riches in gold and silver, and Indian spices, silks, and drugs were imported through new channels into all the countries inhabited by the Teutonic races. This is from the 1870s, so Teutonic races would be Northern Europeans, kind of like Germanic. Mercantile wealth, with all its refinements, acquired new importance in the eyes of the nations. The world opened towards the east and the west. So obviously Europe is in the middle. I don't know if I have a world map, but Europe was allowed to... But you have also the discovery of Vasco da Gama, for example. He's Portuguese, and he goes around the Cape of Good Hope around South Africa, Southern Africa, and he's able to reach India by another sea route. Well, easily. Well, that's the only sea route. But yeah, he's able to, instead of the land route. The horizon of knowledge extended. Popular delusions were dispelled. Liberality of mind was acquired. The material prosperity of the Western nations was increased. Taste became more refined and social intercourse more cheerful. So it kind of implies that society became more materialistic, or society began to enjoy certain material comforts. I guess goods also, because have you tried this spice? It's called nutmeg. Have you tried this spice? It's called saffron. Material comforts through trade and goods. It became, I mean, we still have this very much today, you know, when people try to say, try a kale smoothie, try a Kobe steak. Art. The section is called Revival of the Arts. Art in all its departments was everywhere revived at this epoch. So we're talking again 14th, 15th centuries. Houses became more comfortable and churches more splendid. The utensils of husbandry and cookery were improved. Husbandry is taking care of animals, farm animals. Linen and woolen manufactures supplanted the coarser fabrics of the Dark Ages. Music became more elaborate, and the present system of notation was adopted. So musical notation, which is the scales, do, re, mi, but also, you know, having the dots and the clefs on there. It's pretty important for having it correct. It's about 500 years ago again. That's the time period we're talking about. The genius of the sculptor again gave life and beauty to a marble block, and painting was carried to greater perfection than by the ancient Greeks and Romans. Florence, Venice, Milan, and Rome became seats of various schools of this beautiful art. So think like Florence is up here, Venice is up here, Milan is up here. So we're talking about the Italian cities. And Venice especially was able to become a mercantile city and send out ships every which way, much like we were talking about how the Portuguese and the French and the Dutch were able to send out ships. Rome became seats of various schools of this beautiful art, of which Michelangelo, Correggio, the Carracci, and Raphael were the most celebrated masters, all of whom were distinguished for peculiar excellences and never since surpassed or even equaled. The Flemish artists were scarcely behind the Italian. Flemish is Belgium, because like they're kind of a section over here. Like when Netherlands became Protestant, the Belgium remained Catholic. So, and then they're divided further into 4 communities, like French-speaking, Flemish-speaking. The Flemish artists were scarcely behind the Italian, and the Rubens of Antwerp may well rank with Correggio and Titian. I don't know who that is. To Raphael, however, the world has as yet furnished no parallel. So he's saying Raphael was the greatest ever. The political and social structure of society changed. The Crusades, long before, had given a shock to the political importance of the feudal aristocracy, and reviving commerce and art had shaken the system to its foundations. The Flemish weavers had arisen, and a mercantile class had clamored for new privileges. In the struggle of classes, and in the misfortune of nobles, monarchs had perceived the advantages they might gain, and fortunate circumstances enabled them to raise absolute thrones and restore a central power, always so necessary to the cause of civilization. The influence of feudalism. Feudalism had answered many useful ends in the Dark Ages. It had secured a reciprocity of duties between a lord and his vassal. It had restored loyalty truth, fidelity among semi-barbarians. It had favored the cultivation of the soil. It had raised up a hardy rural population. It had promoted chivalry and had introduced into Europe the modern gentleman. It had ennobled friendship and spread the graces of urbanity and gentleness among rough and turbulent warriors. But it had also, like all human institutions, become corrupt and failed to answer the ends for which it was instituted. So he was saying feudalism is useful in Europe for a while, but by this point, it had become a corrupt system. It had become an oppressive social despotism. It had widened the distinction between noble and ignoble classes. It had produced selfishness and arrogance among the nobles, and a mean and cringing sycophancy. Sycophancy is basically sucking up, an interesting use of the word cringing, among the people. So basically, they had to depend on the nobles all the time. So they were like, sire, 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 sire. It had perpetuated privileges among the aristocracy, exceedingly unjust and ruinous to the general welfare of society. It therefore fell before the advancing spirit of the age, and monarchies and republics were erected on its ruins. So instead of the feudal lord, you had kings and queens. The people, as well as the monarchs, had learned the secret of their power. They learned that by combining their power, they could successfully resist their enemies. The principle of association was learned. Combinations of masses took place. Free cities were multiplied. A population of artificers and small merchants. Artificers would be artists or people who carve or whittle or shape or, people who make their own stuff. And free farmers arose. They discussed their privileges and asserted their independence. Political liberty was born, and its invaluable blessings were conceived if they were not realized. So, what he's saying is everybody began to live in a more monarchist, but also more free trade environment. And even though everybody didn't benefit it, or it wasn't always a perfect free market, I'm sure you had to pay taxes, or, tithe, or give up your oldest son to the church, or something like that. What it was that people could see the benefits of the free market. And the intellectual state of Europe received an impulse as marked and beneficent as the physical and social. Effects of Scholasticism. The scholastic philosophy, with its dry and technical logic, its abstruse formulas, and its subtle refinements, ceased to satisfy the wants of the human mind, now craving light and absolute knowledge in all departments of science and philosophy. So, on the one hand, you can perceive it as a diss, but on the other hand, we should also kind of recognize what he's saying, was that scholastic philosophy, which is like Thomas Aquinas, they sparked a curiosity, which is very useful to the intellectual quest of Europe. But at this point, Europe was almost outgrowing it, or it needed something more. But at the same time, when you say that it sparked something, you were just also conceding that it was useful for its time, and it was a very good thing. Like feudalism, it had once been useful, but like that institution, it had also become corrupted, and an object of sarcasm and mockery. It had trained the European mind for the discoveries of the 16th century. It had raised up an inquisitive spirit, and had led to profound reflections on the existence of God, on his attributes and will, on the nature of the soul, on the faculties of the mind, and on the practical duties of life. But this philosophy became pedantic and cold, covered, as with a funereal shade, the higher pursuits of life, and diverted attention from what was practical and useful. That earnest spirit, which raised up Luther and Bacon, demanded of the great masters of thought something which the people would understand, and something which could do them good. So he's kind of gotten onto the point over here. The people wanted something they could understand. Like, it was great that all the universities were engaging this. And it was great that it was sparking a revolution in thought. In poetry, the insipid and immoral songs of the Provençal bards gave place to the immortal productions of the great creators of the European languages. Dante led the way in Italy. So this is what we have from Latin down to the modern languages that are spoken today. Dante led the way in Italy and gave to the world the Divine Comedy, a masterpiece of human genius, which raised him to the rank of Homer and Virgil. Petrarch followed in his steps, and if not as profound or original as Dante, yet is unequaled as an enthusiastic songster of ideal love. He also gave a great impulse to civilization by his labors in collecting and collating manuscripts. Boccaccio also lent his aid in the revival of literature and wrote a series, I think he's the first novelist, of witty though objectionable stories, from which the English Chaucer borrowed the notion of his Canterbury Tales. Chaucer is the father of English poetry, and kindled a love of literature among his isolated countrymen, and was one of the few men who, in the evening of his days, looked upon the world without austerity, and expressed himself with all the vivacity of youthful feeling. Such were some of the leading events and circumstances which gave a new life to European society and created a desire for better days. Now let's make a note of that too. So one thing we learned in political science was that a rising expectation is what actually causes the revolution. For better days. When people have reduced expectations, they're probably not going to revolt. But when they have a little bit of good and they want more, that is likelier to make them destroy the government in a revolution. All of these causes of improvement acted and reacted on each other in various ways, and prepared the way to new and great developments of action and passion. These new energies were, however, unfortunately checked by a combination of evils which had arisen in the Dark Ages, which required to be subverted before any great progress could be reasonably expected. Ecclesiastical corruptions. So that's, again, we're getting to the meat of the thing. Ecclesiastical corruptions. Right, so obviously any history of Luther and the Protestant Reformation is going to emphasize this. These evils were most remarkable in the church of itself, and almost extinguished the light which Christ and his apostles had kindled. The church looked with an evil eye on many of the greatest improvements and agitations of that age, and attempted to suppress the spirit of insurrection which had arisen against the abuses and follies of past ages. It was a very conservative institution. Great ideas were ridiculed, and daring spirits were crushed. There were many good men in the church who saw and who lamented prevailing corruptions, but their voice was overwhelmed by the clamors of interested partisans, or silenced by the authority of the popes. The character of the popes themselves was not what was expected of the heads of the visible church, or what was frequently exhibited in those ignorant and superstitious times, when the papacy fulfilled, in the opinion of many enlightened Protestants, a benevolent mission. So at one point, he's giving here that the papacy was a benevolent mission. And it's interesting of him to say that, because you would think a Protestant wouldn't even go as far to say that. None had the disinterestedness of Gregory I or the talents of Gregory VII. There had been a time when the great central spiritual monarchy of Rome had been exercised for the peace and tranquility of Europe, when it was uniformly opposed to slavery and war, when it was a mild and paternal government, which protected innocence and weakness, when it punished innocence and crime. The time was when popes had been elevated for their piety and learning, when they had lived as saints and died as martyrs. But that time had passed. The Roman Church did not keep up with the spirit or the wants of the age, and moreover did not reform itself from vices, which had been overlooked in ages of ignorance and superstition. In the 15th century, many great abuses scandalized a body of men who should have been the lights of the world, and the sacred pontiffs themselves set examples of unusual depravity. Julius II marched at the head of armies. So it started out as a benevolent mission, but now they were military leaders, possibly even aggression, right? Like, it's probably not a defensive war, it's kind of being implied with the tone. Alexander VI secured his election by bribery and reigned by extortion. So they also used extortion and bribery. So they were financially kind of corrupt. He poisoned his own cardinals and bestowed on his son Caesar Borgia, an incarnated demon, the highest dignities and rewards. It was common for the popes to sell the highest offices in the church for money, to place boys on episcopal thrones, episcopal means bishop, to absolve the most heinous and scandalous crimes for gold, to encourage the massacre of heretics, and to disgrace themselves by infamous vices. And a general laxity of morals existed among all orders of the clergy. They were ignorant, debauched, and ambitious. The monks were exceedingly numerous, had ceased to be men of prayer and contemplation, as in the days of Benedict and Bernard, and might be seen frequenting places of demoralizing excitement, devoted to pleasure, and enriched by inglorious gains. So all this behavior of extortion and bribery, that was also done among the orders of priests and monks. They were rich and debaucherous. Obviously, debauchery kind of means you're having the wrong kind of fun. But they enjoyed everything, including riches. The evils by which the church encouraged were more dangerous than the vices of its members. These evils were inherent in the papal system and were hard to be subverted. There were corruptions of doctrine and corruptions in the government and customs of the church. There generally prevailed throughout Christendom the belief in papal infallibility. So again, we're talking about the 15th century, but it's talking about how papal infallibility was already kind of a church notion, which is interesting because it wasn't dogmatized until the 19th century, about 4 centuries later. Which notion subverted the doctrines of the Bible and placed its truths at least on a level with the authority of the schoolmen being the doctors of the church, well learned. It favored the various usurpations of the popes and strengthened the bonds of spiritual despotism. So the accusation here is that papal infallibility was being abused. It was used as a license for abuses. Infallibility. I thought it was a modern doctrine, but it was pretty much being used here in the wrong way, even this far back. The Pope also claimed to control over secular princes, as well as the supremacy of the church. Hildebrand was content, I think this was a saint, was content with riveting the chains of universal spiritual authority, the evil and absurdity of which cannot well be exaggerated. But his more ambitious successors sought to reduce the kings of the earth to perfect vassalage, and when in danger of having their enormous usurpations torn from them, were ready to fill the world with discord and war. Okay, yeah, what I think he was like one of the first popes. And Germanic legend, I don't know. But trying to say they were very militant But the worldly popes of the 15th century also aspire to be temporal princes. Temporal means of this world, princes means kings. So they were worldly kings, or temporal princes. They established the most elegant court in Europe. They supported large armies. They sought to restore the splendor of imperial Rome. They became ambitious of founding great families. They enriched their nephews and relations at the sacrifice of the best interests of their church. They affected great state and dignity. They built glorious palaces. They ornamented their capital with pictures and statues. The territories of Rome were, however, small. The lawful revenues of the popes were insufficient to gratify their extravagance and pomp, but money, nevertheless, they must have. In order to raise it, they resorted to extortion and corruption. They imposed taxes on Christendom, direct and indirect. These were felt as an intolerable burden, but such was the superstition of the times that they were successfully raised. So the people were so superstitious, the people were so foolish, really, because, right, like superstitions kind of aren't real. The foolish people gave their money, and that's how they were able to raise all their extravagant pomp, or all the ceremony and jewels that royalty and a royal parade, like a red carpet parade, entails. They imposed taxes on Christendom, direct and indirect. These were felt as an intolerable burden, but such was the superstition of the times that they were successfully raised. But even these were insufficient to gratify papal avarice is greed, and rapacity. Let's look up rapacity. So they were taking all the money and the loot, and they were still not happy. Rapacity is excessive greed or grasping. So they were still like, gimme, gimme, gimme. They then resorted, in their necessities, to the meanest acts, imposed on the simplicity of their subjects, and finally adopted the most infamous custom which ever disgraced the world, the sale of indulgences. So he has a whole section which is titled this, and so he calls it the most disgraceful custom. You can see how reasonable it is to read, even though it was written 200 years ago at this point. Well, more like 150 almost. They pardoned sins for money, granted sales of indulgences for crime. A regular scale for absolution was graded. Every proclamation was made every 50 and finally every 25 years, of a year of jubilee, when plenary remission of all sin was promised to those who should make a pilgrimage to Rome. And so great was the influx of strangers, and consequently of wealth, to Rome, that on one occasion it was collected into piles by rakes. They were literally raking it in. It is computed that 200,000 deluded persons visited the city in a single month, but the vast sums they brought to Rome, and the still greater sums which were obtained by the sale of indulgences, which is when you forgive a sin for money, and by various taxations, were all squandered in ornamenting the city and in supporting a luxurious court. A court is the royal group of advisors for the king or pope, profligate cardinals, and superfluous ministers of a corrupted religion. Then was erected the splendid church of St. Peter, more after the style of Grecian temples and after the model of the Gothic cathedrals of York and Cologne. Glorious was that monument of reviving art. Wonderful was its lofty dome. But the vast sums required to build it opened the eyes of Christendom to the extravagance and presumption of the popes. And this splendid trophy of their glory also became the emblem of their broken power. So because they built the Vatican Palace out of the money from indulgences, the people of Europe were kind of outraged, and they kind of saw how corrupt the religion was in that sense. It was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. Notice it was built after a Grecian temple instead of the cathedrals that were kind of the motif at the time. Their palaces and temples made an imposing show, but detracted from their real strength, which consisted in the affections of their spiritual subjects. Their outward grandeur, like the mechanical agencies which kings employ, was but a poor substitute for the invisible power of love. In all ages, among all people, that cheap defense which supports thrones and kingdoms. So because the people loved it, the kingdom held together, or in this case, the unity of Europe, you could say. Another great evil was the prevalence of an idolatrous spirit. In the churches and chapels, and even in private families, were innumerable images of saints and pictures of the Virgin, relics, crucifixes, designed at first to kindle a spirit of devotion among the rude and uneducated, but gradually becoming objects of real adoration. So again, there's development of the doctrine that the wafer of the Eucharist was the literal presence. Intercessions were supposed to be made by the Virgin Mary and by favorite saints, more efficacious with deity than penitence and prayers of the erring and sinful themselves. So the criticism here is that Mary and the saints become more important than prayers and repentance to God. And so that's an objection that he's making. The influence of this veneration for martyrs and saints was degrading to the mind and became a very lucrative source of profit to the priests, who peddled the bones and relics of saints as they did indulgences, and who invented innumerable lies to attest to the genuineness and antiquity of the objects they sold, of all of which were part of the great system of fraud and avarice which the church permitted. So relics of the saints, these are their fingers. These are their skulls. These are their garments. These are their rosaries. This is anything a saint owned, and therefore they're considered as holy. And they could also be, for example, the original cross of Christ or the original cup of the Holy Grail. So relics is so in other words, the religion also believed in a lot of superstitious relics. Again, the public worship of God was in a language the people could not understand, but rendered impressive by the gorgeous dresses of the priests, and the magnificence of the altar, and the images and vessels of silver and gold, reflecting their splendor by the light of wax candles on the somber pillars and roofs and windows of the Gothic church, and the effect heightened by exciting music and other appeals to the taste and imagination, rather than to the reason and the heart. So the religion was based on music and cult worship of the Eucharist. You could add music. Music is great, for basically when people are uneducated, but for doctrine and hymns. But at a certain point, when you have movable typing invented, gunpowder, exploration, trade in goods, increased curiosity, increased notation, and a corrupt priesthood, then you would expect a reaction of a purification. The sermons of the clergy were frivolous and ill-adapted to the spiritual wants of the people. Men went to the Vatican, says the learned and philosophical rank, not to pray, but to contemplate the Belvedere Apollo. This is an artist, and that's a statue we're painting. They disgraced the most solemn festivals by open profanations. Profanation is profane, which is the opposite of sacred. It's like when you disrespect something that's holy. The clergy in their services sought the means of exciting laughter. One would mock the cuckoo. Cuckoo, cuckoo. Another recite indecent stories about St. Peter. Luther, when he visited Italy, was extremely shocked at the infidel spirit which prevailed among the clergy, who were hostile to the circulation of the scriptures, and who encouraged persecutions and inquisitions. This was the age when the dreadful tribunal of the Inquisition flourished. So the Inquisition was torturing or forcing people to convert, or getting people to give up the names of the other Jews or Muslims or heretics who were not really. Forced confessions and forced conversions. considered pretty evil today to force somebody to convert by force. And although its chief enormities were perpetuated, the chief enormities, the violations of the Inquisition, most of the worst that happened was perpetuated in Spain and Portugal. It never had an existence in England, but little influence in France and Germany. But if the Church did not resort in all countries to that dread tribunal, the Inquisition, which subjected youth, beauty, and innocence to the inquisitorial vengeance of the narrow-minded Dominican monks, still she was hostile to free inquiry, and to all efforts made to emancipate the reason of men. So even if it was only in some countries, namely Spain and Portugal, then it still didn't change the fact that the Church had a closed-minded attitude towards knowledge and freedom. The spirit of religious persecution, which inflamed the Roman Church to punish all dissenters from the doctrine and abuses she promulgated, can never be questioned. The Waldenses and Albigenses had suffered, and in darker times, almost incredible hardships and miseries had almost been annihilated by the dreadful crusade which was carried on against them, so that 200,000 had perished for supposed heresy. So they'd killed 200,000 heretics. It wasn't easy being a heretic against Rome. But the reference is not now made to this wholesale massacre, but to instances of individual persecution, which showed the extreme jealousy and hatred of Rome of all new opinions. John Huss and Jerome of Prague were publicly burned for attempting to reform the Church, and even Savonarola, who did not deny the authority of the popes, was condemned to the flames for denying the vices of his age rather than the evils of the Church. So, they were also finally, this is another thing, they were killing critics. Liberal critics, critics who believed in the papacy, heretics. So this illustrates a necessity for reform, which is, I guess, we could call this whole section that. This whole section talks about the need for reform. And I think that would be a good way to go on to page 2. These multiplied evils, which checked the spirit of improvement, called loudly for reform. Councils were assembled for the purpose, but councils supported rather than diminished the evils of which even princes complained, princes being kings. So even the kings were saying the popes were a problem, but all the bishops were supporting the pope and giving him more power. The reform was not destined to come from dignitaries in the church or state, not from bishops nor philosophers nor kings, but from an obscure teacher of divinity being religion, in a German university, whom the genius of a reviving and awakened age had summoned into the field of revolutionary warfare. So he was, basically they're saying, a university professor leading a spiritual revolution or a religious revolution, but it was also a military revolution. Political, let's call it. So it's kind of weird that, but he was also the product of an enlightened age, or a very reforming age, in which a lot of things were being discovered, a lot of people were looking at things a new way, and the church was kind of stopping things. And so it kind of like called on him to take the brakes off history and move humanity towards a better era. It was reserved for Martin Luther to commence the first successful rebellion against the despotism of Rome. Despotism is like dictatorship or harsh rule. And to give the greatest impulse to freedom of thought and the general spirit of reform, which 10 centuries had seen. So in 1,000 years, nobody moved forward history the way he did. So I guess he's saying like 400. Like, in other words, it was the biggest kick in the butt that history had received up until this point. The most prominent event in modern history is unquestionably the Protestant Reformation, and it was by far the most momentous in its results. It gave rise, directly or indirectly, to the great wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, as well as those rival sects which agitated the theological world. It is connected with the great enterprises of monarchs, with the struggles of the Huguenots, French Protestants, and Puritans, English Radical Protestants, with the diffusion of knowledge, and with the progress of civil and religious liberty in Europe. An event, therefore, of such interest and magnitude may well be adopted as a starting point in history, and will accordingly be the first subject of special notice. History is ever most impressive and philosophical when the great changes and revolutions are traced to the agency of great spiritual ideas. And moreover, history is so complicated that it is difficult to unravel it except by tracing the agency of great causes, rather than by detailing the fortunes of kings and nobles. Chapter 2. Martin Luther and his associates. So if you haven't guessed by now, Martin Luther is the person we're talking about when I said a university professor becomes the greatest reformer in history. The early life of Luther. Martin Luther was born in 1483 in Saxony, which is in Germany. His father was a miner of Mansfield, and his ancestors were peasants who lived near the summit of the forest. Now, his father was a miner, which again just kind of shows you that he was a very working class guy and he could speak to the poor, and his understanding was the poor. So the fact that he was the son of a miner and he also led this powerful revolution in history, possibly the greatest according to this historian. His early years were spent at Mansfield in extreme poverty. He was very poor, and he earned his bread by singing hymns before the houses of the village. At the age of 15, he went to a high school, and at the age of 18, he went to the University of Erfurt, where he made considerable progress in the sciences then usually taught, which, however, were confined chiefly to the scholastic philosophy. He did not know either Greek or Hebrew, but read the Bible in Latin. In 1505, he took his Bachelor of Arts, and shortly after his religious struggles commenced. He had witnessed a fearful storm, which alarmed him while on a visit at his father's house, and he was much depressed by the death of an intimate friend. In that age, the serious and melancholy generally sought monastic retreats, and Luther, thirsty after divine knowledge and anxious to save his soul, resolved to forsake the world and become a monk. So a monk is kind of like a priest, but what you do is you live in a community, and you live in a monastic community or a monastery, and you just copy books, and you live like with a group of your fellow brother monks. He entered an Augustinian monastery soon after obtaining his first degree, but the duties and studies of monastic life did not give his troubled soul the repose he sought. He submitted to all the irksome labors which the monks imposed. He studied the fathers and the schoolmen. He practiced the most painful austerities. Austerities meaning like fasting, or like not buying anything, or staying away from worldly pleasures. And fastings and self-lacerations. Laceration is when you cut. So when you whip yourself, you're cutting yourself. And the cut of the whip is called a laceration. Still, he was troubled with religious fears. His brethren encouraged his good works, but his perplexities and doubts remained. In this state of mind, he was founded by Staupitz, the vicar is priest, of the order, who was, so the head priest, visiting in his tour of inspection with a view to correct the bad morals of the monasteries. He sympathized with Luther in his religious feelings and treated him with great kindness, and recommended the readings of the scriptures and also the works of St. Augustine, whose theological views he himself had braced. So the senior priest of the order, and it was an Augustinian monastery, said, read St. Augustine more, along with scripture. And Luther did base, I'm told, his ideas on this. St. Augustine. Although St. Augustine was a great oracle in the Roman Church, still his doctrines pertaining to personal salvation differed in spirit from those which were encouraged by the Roman Catholic divines being theologians or priests generally, who were attached less importance to the justification by faith than did the venerated Bishop of Hippo. So he's also called the Bishop of Hippo. I didn't realize it was spelled with a Y back then. But it would make sense because we spell it like hippopotamus. In that age of abuses, great importance was attached by the church to austerities, penance, and absolutions for money. So again, the church was emphasizing money, and St. Augustine was going back to justification by faith alone. But Luther, deeply imbued with the spirit of Augustine, at length found light and repose and joy in the doctrine of justification by faith alone. So, to put it crudely, St. Augustine was preaching money, according to this. And the church was kind of putting money at the bottom of a long list of other things, like faith and penance, or obedience to the church. But Luther, deeply imbued with the spirit of Augustine, at length found light and repose and joy in the doctrine of faith alone, of justification by faith alone. This became more and more the idea of his life, especially at this time. The firmness of his convictions on this point became extraordinary, and his spiritual gladness now equaled his former depression and anxiety. So he became happy. He was soon to find a sphere for the development of his views. Luther was consecrated as a priest in 1507. So let's go with 1441 as the movable type. So 70 years later, 1507, you have Luther becoming a priest. Of the Catholic Church. He was invited by Frederick, Elector of Saxony, to become a professor. He was the political leader, like the prince. To become a professor in the university which he had established at Wittenberg. Now, that's really interesting because I didn't know that it was a new university. But basically the prince says, I'm starting a new university. Do you want to come teach there? Which is quite remarkable. He was, in fact, 25 years of age, and that he should have been selected at that early age to teach dialectics is a strong argument in favor of his attainments and genius. It's true, when you read his commentary on Romans, which was written before he became a radical Protestant revolutionary and just a regular student, he's very much a genius. He now began to apply himself to the study of Greek and Hebrew, and delivered lectures on biblical theology, and his novel method and great enthusiasm attracted a crowd of students. But his sermons were more striking than even his lectures, and he was invited by the Council of Wittenberg to be the preacher for the city. So now he's the city preacher. So you could see, because the prince invited him, and now the city is paying him to be the preacher, he's already having different patrons. Elector, technically. He's, when you have a different patron, you can also kind of change your message a little bit. You don't have to be. His eloquence and learning and his zeal now attracted considerable attention, and the elector himself visited Wittenberg to hear him preach. In 1512, he was sent on an embassy to Rome, and while in Italy obtained useful knowledge of the actual state of the hierarchy and of the morals and religion. So finally he goes to Rome in 1512, but he's meanwhile a very successful college student at that time. But, it's interesting because when you're Catholic, you think about Rome all the time. So actually going to Rome is a very holy kind of experience. Julius II, a warlike pontiff, sat on the throne of St. Peter, and the Eternal City was the scene of folly, which is foolishness, dissipation, which is evaporation. I don't even want to know. I guess they're just like throwing money around and losing it. And classical extortion. Luther returned to Germany completely disgusted with everything he had seen. The levity and frivolity of the clergy. Levity is lightness, frivolity is waste. And the ignorance and vices of the people. He was too earnest in his religious views and feelings to take much interest in the works of art, or the pleasures which occupied the attention of the Italians, and the impression of the general inequality, and corruption of Rome never passed away, and probably gave a new direction to his thoughts. So it's almost being said here, he witnessed the corruption of Rome 4 years after. And he never forgot it. So we're just about the 1 hour mark now, and I don't want to overwhelm anyone. But I feel like for this lecture, we'll have a part 3, I guess. But so this is just the introduction of Luther. What we'll be doing is we will actually go into the Anglican story after we go over Luther. But I'm not going to put a time on it. I just want to read through it. And it's open source. I encourage everyone to read through it. Man, there's a lot of pages. But thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it enlightening. God bless you. Have a good day.